Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. It's quiet here in the Valley of the Kings. The wind glides across sun-bleached cliffs without much intention. You hear a stone shift under its own weight. Sand slips past footprints made a century ago and still somehow preserved. It's a place of silence and of labor long since forgotten. And yet, beneath the dust and behind the gold mask, everyone knows. Someone once stood on a rickety wooden scaffold. In his hand, a long, pointed brush. In his nose, the scent of crushed ochre and resin. And before him, a blank limestone wall meant to guide a dead boy into the afterlife. That brush-wielding figure, unnamed, unsung, was among the last people to ever see the chamber alive. He left no signature, but his work remains. This is his story, or what remains of it. Tutankhamun, as you know, was a young and relatively unimportant pharaoh during Egypt's 18th dynasty, at least by the standards of kings like Ramesses II or Thutmose III. His reign lasted about 9 years. He came to power as a child and died likely before the age of 20, with his legacy nearly erased by the same forces that brought him to the throne. But death, Egypt, was never final. His tomb, famously intact when discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, wasn't truly built for him. It was small, oddly structured, and bore the telltale signs of haste, which meant that the artists brought in to decorate it were not given time for perfection. They were given time to cover, not to glorify, but to complete. And perhaps, in that rush, they left behind something even more valuable, a trace of their process, a faint outline, a correction, smudged the fingerprints of forgotten workers. The tomb of Tutankhamun is designated KV62 in the Royal Necropolis numbering system. It's different from most New Kingdom royal tombs. It lacks the long corridors, the large, pillared halls, the expansive side chambers. Instead, it is cramped, compressed. Its walls were never fully smoothed. Keys, in places, chisel marks, are still visible beneath the plaster. The paint flakes easily, unsealed by any protective resin or varnish. In fact, the entire burial chamber, the room with the famous golden paintings, may have been completed in less than 2 weeks. Why? Because time was against them. Tutankhamun's death, believed to be sudden, triggered a royal crisis. No tomb had been fully prepared for him. The artisans of Deir el-Medina, a village of workers employed to craft the tombs of kings, were pulled in quickly. The walls were measured, the paint mixed in shallow bowls. The brushes, often made from split palm fibers, were sharpened, and the painting began. If you visit the burial chamber today, the first thing you notice is the yellow background. It's everywhere on all 4 walls surrounding each figure. It is not a vibrant yellow, but a faded ochre yellow, earthy and dull. This was not a symbolic choice. It was a practical one. Yellow, ochre, was among the cheapest pigments in the ancient Egyptian painter's palette, derived from hydrated iron oxide, and mixed with water and gum arabic. It could be produced in bulk and spread quickly, unlike the rare and expensive Egyptian blue. Yellow ochre covered easily and dried fast. The painters had 4 walls to finish before the burial could proceed, so they began with the background. It was likely applied by apprentice workers, using broad strokes, slathering the pigment over the plaster as others traced outlines. Speed was key. Precision would come later, in layers, and even that was not guaranteed. Because here's where it gets strange. Infrared imaging conducted in the early 2000s revealed something unusual. Underneath the surface paint of the burial chamber are guidelines, sketch lines, and in some cases, mistakes. Arms too long, feet drawn twice, a crown tilted in one version, corrected in the next. The painters had altered their work mid-process. More importantly, the painting style itself doesn't quite match the rest of the 18th dynasty tombs. Lines are less crisp, the figures are less idealized, the scenes are simpler, almost formulaic. There are only 3 major scenes in the entire chamber. One shows I, the successor, performing the opening of the mouth ritual on Tutankhamun's mummy. Another depicts Tutankhamun greeted by the goddess Nut. The third shows him embraced by Osiris. That's it. 3 scenes, almost too minimal, and this has led many Egyptologists to a quiet but growing conclusion. The artists weren't the best Egypt had to offer. They were the second team at Deir el-Medina, the workers' village across the Theban hills. Records survive on limestone fragments and papyri. These documents tell of painters, stonecutters, plasterers, and scribes. They were paid in grain. They received beer rations. They went on strike when supplies were late. We know the names of some Pashedu Kabiknit and Herkipshef. None are linked to Tutankhamun's tomb directly, but the style of the burial chamber suggests that a team of modest skill, perhaps apprentices or those between royal commissions, were called in, and they had to work under enormous pressure. Some scholars estimate that the chamber's entire decoration took just 10 days. That would have meant working in heat, in darkness, by torchlight, and amid the looming presence of burial officials and priests preparing the boy king's embalmed body nearby. It was not a ceremony of divine glory. It was a cleanup, and yet, despite the haste, they finished it, just barely, when Carter's team entered the chamber in 1923. They noted something curious on the north wall. Dark spots, hundreds of them. They dotted the surface like pinpricks, brown, greenish, and uneven. At first, they were thought to be paint splatters, but later analysis showed they were mold, not modern, ancient. This mold had bloomed before the tomb was sealed. How? Because the paint was still wet when the burial happened. The chamber had not dried, and when the tomb was sealed with no airflow, no sunlight, the moisture allowed fungal growth, spores, trapped inside for 3,000 years. To this day, those dark blotches remain, a biological reminder of how quickly the painters had to finish and how imperfect the entire process really was. So the next time you see an image of Tutankhamun's tomb, or the iconic scene of him embraced by Osiris, pause for a moment, look past the gold, and imagine the man who painted that arm, who dipped a brush into ochre and followed a traced outline. He wasn't trying to make history. He was just trying to finish before the priests came, before the torches burned out, before the boy's body arrived, and he left behind not a masterpiece, but something far more human, a rushed, flawed, holy mural, painted not for glory, but for duty, for duty. If you walk the dusty paths of Deir el-Medina today, what you'll find are half-crumbled walls of rectangular homes, their stone outlines still visible in the bright Egyptian sun. The ground is coarse with gravel and limestone, a clay shards litter. The sand, many of them once parts of small amphorae, or the flat limestone flakes known as astraca, the ancient equivalent of sticky notes. But long ago, a small village was the nerve center of royal eternity. Here, artists, masons, plasterers, scribes, and overseers lived not far from the tombs they crafted in the cliffs. They were not free in the way you and I might define freedom. They could not leave without permission. Okay, they lived on government rations, took part in religious observances, and were subject to tight control from state-appointed officials. But they were respected, skilled, and trusted with secrets no outsider could know: the layout of the tombs, the order of decoration, even the sacred texts themselves. They worked in 2 rotating crews, each one serving 8 days on, then resting for 2. And it's likely that when Tutankhamun's death was announced, one of those 2 teams, or a scrambled group drawn from both, was summoned urgently. But before they ever picked up a brush, there were steps. Steps most people forget. First, the limestone walls of the burial chamber had to be prepared. Limestone in the Valley of the Kings is not always of the highest quality. It's often cracked, brittle, or uneven. Before any painting could be done, the surface had to be smoothed with copper chisels. Smoothing phase took time and left chisel marks, many of which are still visible beneath the painted layers of Tutankhamun's tomb. Once the walls were chiseled flat, a coating of fine gypsum plaster was applied. This plaster was made from crushed gypsum stone, mixed with water, straw, and sometimes animal glue to help it bind. Applied while wet, it dried into a firm, matte surface, just porous enough to accept paint, but not so rough that it would crumble. It had to be done in stages, one wall at a time, and that alone could take days, unless many Egyptologists suspect they were rushing. Evidence of this can still be seen on the west wall of the burial chamber. In some areas, the plaster is cracking. It was likely applied too quickly or too thinly in certain spots. Even Carter noted the less than refined finish in his early reports. Once the plaster dried, or at least began to dry, the artists moved in, and with them came the grids. Egyptian tomb painting was not improvisational, it was mathematical. Artists drew grids onto the plaster using red ochre or charcoal. Each figure was assigned a fixed number of squares in height, usually around 18 squares from feet to hairline, with precise proportions for arms, shoulders, torsos, and heads. These grids helped multiple artists work on the same wall without their figures looking out of sync. On the north wall of Tutankhamun's tomb, you can still faintly detect these guidelines beneath the pigment. They run vertically and horizontally like the early stages of a graph. Why does this matter? Because it shows us that the artists, despite the speed, still followed its protocol. They weren't simply rushing to finish. They were rushing to finish properly. Let's talk about those artists, not the names, because their names are lost, but the process. In an average tomb, painters worked in a sequence. The outliner went first, tracing scenes with red ochre. The master reviewed and corrected outlines using black paint. The filler added color, blue, green, red, and yellow. The detailer added fine lines, jewelry, hieroglyphs, facial features, and finally, the overseer inspected the wall and ordered any last-minute changes in Tutankhamun's burial chamber. We see fewer layers. The outlines are simpler. Some areas, like the toes on Osiris's foot, were left unfinished. This suggests a pared-down team, perhaps only 2 or 3 working at a time, switching roles as needed. It also suggests that they were not given time for corrections. Once the background was laid and the figures outlined, paint was applied in flat, even strokes. The blue pigment used for the gods' wigs was likely Egyptian blue, a synthetic pigment made from ground sand, copper, and calcium, fired at high heat. The red pigment used for male skin came from iron oxide red ochre. Female skin was often painted a pale yellow, though not. The sky goddess on the ceiling is depicted in gold, not real gold, but yellow ochre. Still, it gave the illusion of holiness, even in haste. The illusion of divinity was non-negotiable. There is a story that has been passed down from Deir el-Medina, found on a scrap of Ostraco. It tells of a painter named Neferhotep, who was reprimanded for leaving a brush out overnight. It hardened. He had to remake it from scratch the next day, delaying the entire team. This tells us 2 things. Even mundane tools had to be crafted on site. Even minor delays mattered. Now, imagine the pressure facing the men inside Tutankhamun's burial chamber. The king's body, freshly embalmed, was waiting. The gold shrines, so large that they barely fit inside the room, had already been assembled. The priests were chanting. The vizier was preparing for the opening of the mouth. ceremony, and, behind all of this, the political situation was unstable. Tutankhamun had no surviving heirs. His death left a vacuum. The sooner the funeral ended, sooner Egypt could move on. So the painters worked by torchlight. They held their brushes in silence. They copied the standard scenes, without deviation, without flourish, and they watched. As the plaster dried unevenly, the paint beaded in spots. The walls cracked under their hands. Still, they kept going, because in ancient Egypt, unfinished tombs were considered dangerous. A king whose burial was incomplete could not pass into the afterlife. One of the most interesting details comes from a 2015 analysis conducted by Waseda University. They used high-resolution photography and X-ray fluorescence to analyze the pigments and application techniques. What they found was subtle but important. Some areas of the burial chamber contained more arsenic than others. Arsenic was not uncommon in red pigments, but its uneven distribution suggests 2 batches of red paint were used. Why would they switch? The answer may be simple. They ran out. They made more, mixed it differently, used what they had, and that, perhaps more than any artistic trait, is what defines Tutankhamun's burial chamber. Resourcefulness. This was a team of laborers and artists doing their best with limited time, perfect materials, and immense pressure. They weren't creating eternal art. They were creating compliance, meeting ritual deadlines, and in doing so, they may have left behind one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of art, a tomb, both rushed and eternal. But one thing remains unexplained. On the north wall, in the scene where it performs the ritual, the depiction of Tutankhamun is off. His posture, his size, his face. Some Egyptologists now believe it wasn't originally meant to be him. That wall, and maybe even the entire tomb, may have been designed for someone else. But who and why would it have been repurposed? For the boy king. It begins with the wall. Not a grand discovery or a golden mask, but a painting, a simple figure, arms stretched in the ceremonial act of opening the mouth. On the north wall of Tutankhamun's tomb, the man performing the rite is painted with care. He wears a short kilt, a crown of blue and gold, and a white sash tied firmly at his waist. He is the vizier. But who is the other figure? The figure being reanimated, the one meant to be Tutankhamun, looks awkward, disproportionate. His posture is slightly askew, his head too large, his arms stiff, and the curve of his neck jarring, almost misaligned with the shoulders. It is as if the figure beneath was never meant to be this boy king, and that single discrepancy has led to one of the longest-standing theories in Egyptology, that Tutankhamun's tomb was originally meant for someone else. But who? And more importantly, why? To understand that, you have to go backward, not just to Tutankhamun's reign, but to the shadow that loomed over it. You have to go back to Akhenaten. Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king, was Tutankhamun's probable father, the pharaoh who appended centuries of religious tradition by discarding the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods in favor of a single deity, Aten, the sun disk. He closed temples, redirected offerings, moved the capital to Akhenaten, modern-day Amarna, and in doing so, destabilized the priesthood and alienated powerful factions across the country. His reign was radical, not in art alone, but in theology, economics, and policy. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt scrambled to restore the old ways. Tutankhamun, the boy king born under the Atenist regime, was swiftly renamed Tutankhamun. He was married off to Enkisenpaten, Akhenaten's daughter, and possibly his own half-sister, and installed as a symbol of religious restoration. But even in death, Akhenaten's shadow lingered. The public was not to speak of him. His statues were defaced. His name was chiseled out from temple walls, and when Tutankhamun died around the age of 18 or 19, there was no grand tomb waiting. because no one had expected him to die so young. Tomb KV 62. The resting place of Tutankhamun is small. It has just 4 rooms, an antechamber, a burial chamber, a treasury, and a small annex. Compare that to the tomb of Ramesses VI KV9. With its long corridor, multiple chambers, celestial ceilings, and deep final resting space, KV62 is modest. 2. Modest for a king, especially one buried with 4 gilded shrines, a chariot, a throne, and over 5,000 funerary objects. So, here's where things get suspicious. On the west wall is a painted scene of the Amduat, the sun god's journey through the 12 hours of the night. Is unusual. It is painted directly onto the plaster, without the full ritual texts usually accompanying such a sacred depiction. On the south wall, depictions of Tutankhamun's funeral show him being transported by boat, but the composition is unusually sparse. And on the north wall, as we've seen, the figures seem off. Now, listen carefully. In 2015, radar scans of the tomb revealed something shocking. Behind the north and west walls, there appeared to be voids, anomalies in the rock. Some hypothesized these could be hidden doorways, perhaps leading to another chamber. Nicholas Reeves, a prominent Egyptologist, proposed that these doorways might connect to an original tomb, one designed not for Tutankhamun, but for Nefertiti. His theory suggested that Tutankhamun had been buried in the front section of her tomb, hurriedly repurposed, because no royal burial was prepared for him. The paintings, then, could have originally shown Nefertiti, and the figures might have been altered, their faces and names changed, their stories rewritten with layers of paint and plaster. So what's the evidence? Its dimensions. The layout of KV6 resembles the tombs of queens, not kings. The orientation, with the burial chamber lying perpendicular to the entrance corridor, is consistent with the royal female burials of the 18th dynasty. Wall paintings. Unlike most royal tombs, Tutankhamun's burial chamber is painted, not carved. This is faster and easier to alter. Pigment analysis. Some areas on the north wall have thicker pigment layers than others, suggesting overpainting. Tool marks. The chisel marks in parts of the tomb differ subtly, indicating possible phases of construction or unfinished work behind a sealed wall. Spatial anomalies. Radar data does show density changes behind the walls, while not confirmed. As rooms, they remain unexplained. But the most telling clue: a name. In the earliest studies of the tomb's objects, Egyptologists found cartouches, the oval frames that encircle royal names, with erased or modified inscriptions. On some of the golden shrines and furniture, the name of Tutankhamun had been inscribed over another royal name, who was beneath. In many cases, Nefertiti. This name is associated with Smenkhare, or possibly Nefertiti under a regnal title. The implication that objects originally made for another royal, perhaps Nefertiti in her brief rule as pharaoh, were reused for Tutankhamun's funeral. The same may have occurred on the tomb walls. Let's take a moment to think about this. If true, it means the image of Tutankhamun you're picturing painted on golden plaster, standing beside Osiris and Anubis, adorned with a blue wig and ceremonial beard, may not have been him at all. It may have been her, covered over, rewritten, the paint changed, the name chiseled, but the body proportions, the stances, those are harder to mask. They remain quietly out of place, quietly echoing a different story. So why would they do this? Why would Egypt reuse a tomb? The answer, as always in history, is simple: necessity. Tutankhamun died unexpectedly, perhaps from a fall, an infection, or genetic illness. There was no grand tomb prepared. Political tensions ran high. The vizier may have seen this as a chance to seize power. He married Ankhesenamun, performed the burial rites himself. Within weeks, Pharaoh. Speed was critical. They couldn't wait, so they took a tomb already in progress. They painted over what they had to. They made it work. And in doing so, they left behind one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world, not through conspiracy or deception, but through urgency. You may wonder why this matters. After all, it's paint, it's pigment on plaster. But in the ancient world, art was not decoration. It was function. To depict a king wrongly or incompletely was to endanger his soul. To reuse a queen's tomb for a king without proper ritual resanctification was to gamble with eternity. And yet, the tomb endured. Through floods, through looters, through 3,000 years of silence. Until one morning in 1922, when a young water boy knocked on a step and the sand shifted, and everything that had been hastily hidden, the painted walls, the overinscribed names, the awkward figures, was revealed again as if it had been waiting, not to speak, but to be noticed, to remind us that even kings were vulnerable. Even immortality could be repainted. It begins not with the figure of a god or a king, but with a blotch dot near the northwest corner of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. Just above the painted foot of Anubis, there's a smudge of brown. At first glance, it looks unremarkable, perhaps a discoloration, a trick of the centuries. But on closer inspection, that stain offers a clue. A quiet, fungal stain. One that only forms when wet paint meets still damp plaster and is trapped in the darkness of a sealed tomb before either has the chance to breathe. In other words, the walls were painted in a rush. You might not notice it at first. The tombs, gold and ochre tones, still glow under the chamber lights. The image is Tutankhamun, greeted by Nut, Tutankhamun before Osiris. Tutankhamun embraced by Qasim, deliberate, sacred, eternal. But slow down. Let your eyes scan left to right. One register is crooked. A head, a hand, a cartouche, just a little off. A line of hieroglyphs ends awkwardly at a corner, wrapped like a leftover string. This is not the precision of the great tombs. This is something else. The ancient Egyptians believed painting was not mere ornament. It was power. To paint a scene of the afterlife was to activate it, to bind the dead to eternity. Every figure, gesture, and glyph was both instruction and invocation, which is why most royal tombs, like those of Seti, I, or Ramesses VI, took years to finish. Artists will prepare fine limestone surfaces, sketch outlines with red ochre, correct them with black pigment, and layer color in stages. Carvers would follow with chisels to make the image eternal in stone. But in Key V6-2, Tutankhamun's tomb, almost everything is painted on simple mud plaster. No deep carvings, no time-consuming murals, and just 4 walls received any decoration at all. The others left bare. This wasn't normal. It was urgent. So who were these painters rushing to complete the eternal home of a king? Unlike other tombs, we have no surviving names of the artisans who painted Tutankhamun's chamber, but we do have their methods, and in the cracks of plaster and uneven strokes can still read their haste. A study conducted by Egyptologist Jeremiah Malik and later expanded by conservation experts from the Getty Institute revealed that the artists likely worked in layers, some painting outlines, others filling in color, while plaster was still drying. Normally, wall sections would be finished in stages, each given time to cure. Here, the entire burial chamber, its north, south, east, and west walls, was likely completed in days, possibly a week, no more. They applied gesso directly over mud plaster, ignoring standard smoothing. Some walls still show uneven patches. The blue and green pigments, hugely stabilized with costly additives, show signs of flaking, especially on the south wall. They worked fast, but not carelessly. In fact, the coordination required suggests they were among the most skilled painters in the Theban workforce. These weren't apprentices, they were masters under pressure. Why the rush? Tutankhamun's death came suddenly. He was a young king, perhaps 18 or 19. And while not robust, he was not expected to die. His burial was not fully prepared. His tomb KV62 was small and incomplete. Most of the chambers were unpainted. The plaster hadn't even cured. And yet, within 70 days, the sacred embalming period, dictated by Egyptian funerary ritual, his body had to be buried, and his tomb sealed, which meant every item had to be moved and every shrine erected, every wall painted, and all while priests, carpenters, goldsmiths, and sculptors raced to complete their duties. The painters. They were likely among the last to enter the tomb. They painted as plaster was still being smoothed. They layered colors as incense filled the chamber, and they exited quietly just before the golden shrines were slid into place. Then the door was shut, darkness returned. The fungus stains began to form, and here something even stranger occurs. Despite the speed, the paintings include ritual precision. The north wall shows Tutankhamun welcomed into the afterlife by Osiris and Nut, the west, while it depicts the 12 hours of night. The Mduat, the south wall, shows his funeral procession with the priests and canopic shrines. The east wall presents his mummified form before Anubis. All the scenes follow correct theological structure, but they exclude one key element: no protective spells. In most royal tombs, walls were adorned with spells from the Book of the Dead, the Litany of Ra, or the Book of Gates texts to protect the deceased from serpents, fire, and eternal confusion. Tutankhamun's walls: no spells, no guards, only images. Why? Possibly because the scribe responsible for drafting the texts was unavailable, or because there simply wasn't time to transcribe sacred chapters from papyrus to plaster, or perhaps it was assumed the objects buried with the king would compensate. His golden shrines, his solar park, his canopic jars, his amulets, and his scarabs were among the most elaborate ever discovered. And in ancient belief, its objects carried power, just as words did. Still, it's notable, the tomb of a king, painted by master artisans, left unguarded by text. One more detail: the artists made mistakes. On the east wall, it defined as Horemheb, the general, was painted twice, once beneath the final layer, then again, slightly repositioned. Infrared scans show ghost figure CAs, redrawn. It's not sloppy, it's rushed, and perhaps confused. After all, the royal succession was in turmoil. The vizier, was preparing to take the throne, and Kisanoman, the widow queen, had no heir. The painters were working in a moment when even names might change. Would A be king? Would Horemheb? What names should they write? What faces should they paint? They chose caution few labels, general titles. That way, no repainting would be needed. And yet, their work endured. Through fungus, heat, looters, flooding, and the pressure of 3,000 years, the paint survived. When Howard Carter peered inside, in 1922, it was the gold that caught the world's attention, but it was the paint that told the real story. A story of men who worked by torchlight, with brushes made of reeds and pigment made from stone. Men who bent over wet plaster, speaking softly, making choices that would outlast them by millennia. They didn't know their names would be forgotten. They only knew that a king must be painted, even if the walls were damp, even if the tomb was small, even if the deadline was death itself. And so they worked quietly, skillfully, quickly, leaving behind more than art. They left behind a secret, a record of what it meant to finish a pharaoh's tomb, not in majesty, but in a hurry. The walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber were silent witnesses, not just to religious belief, but to the material limitations of a collapsing dynasty. Let's slow down here, with the brush still trembling above fresh plaster. There's no crowd of tourists, no buzz of cameras, just the near-suffocating air of a half-prepared tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Circa 1327 BCE. No one says it aloud, but everyone knows this should not be the tomb of a king. The problem of the small tomb, the chamber, was never meant to house royalty. KV6, tomb now famous across the world, was originally designed for a nobleman, perhaps even a queen. Its layout is modest. 4 small rooms, only one of which the burial chamber is decorated. Compare this to the grand halls in multi-chambered tombs of Seti I or Thutmose III, which contain entire cosmological blueprints across dozens of meters of corridor. Tutankhamun's tomb, in contrast, was both short and shallow. Why? Because Tutankhamun was never supposed to be king for long or, perhaps, even at all. His reign followed the religious chaos of Akhenaten's monotheistic revolution. With Egypt still reeling, this boy king's death at such a young age left little time for monument building. KV23, a larger tomb, likely intended for Tutankhamun, was not complete when he died. The decision was made: bury him quickly and repurpose a smaller tomb. Thus, the artisans of the Theban necropolis, painters, plasterers, labarers, found themselves adapting space, adapting tools, adapting timelines, all in service of a burial that needed to be not just adequate, but theologically sound. The drying problem, plaster that wouldn't wait now. Look closer at the wall texture again. The surface beneath the paint is mud plaster, a mix of river silt, chopped straw, and water. This isn't rare for Egyptian tombs, but it's temperamental. It needs time, weeks, ideally months, to dry fully before decoration begins. But Tutankhamun couldn't wait. The mummification process gave the craftsman just 70 days, a period that included all preparations: embalming, construction, transport, ritual. In that rush, plaster went up one day, and painting started the next. And because of that, the paintings absorbed moisture unevenly. Some patches retained water for too long. Fungus bloomed in spots. It's visible even now, centuries later. Faint brown stains, marks that whisper. This was rushed. The painter's palette, earth tones, under pressure, spite the rush. The colors used in the tomb were remarkably faithful to Egyptian artistic conventions. The painters, anonymous yet skillful, made deliberate choices rooted in religious symbolism and accessibility. Here's what they had to work with. Yellow ochre, used generously for the golden skin of gods and the royal figure of Tutankhamun, a symbol of the divine and the eternal, derived from iron oxides and desert clays. Red ochre, used for male skin tones, vibrant garments, and glyphs. This pigment was ground from hematite and mixed with water or egg white. Carbon black, for outlines, hieroglyphs, and the coal-lined eyes of the afterlife's watchers. Soot from burnt plant matter. Malachite green and Egyptian blue, precious but scarce, often reserved for the sacred elements like crowns, amulets, and celestial scenes. Egyptian blue was particularly difficult to produce. It required heating a mix of sand, copper, and natron at extreme temperatures. White gypsum, to brighten and layer, often applied underneath brighter colors to give them more vibrance. These pigments weren't exotic imports. They were made locally, using recipes passed down for generations. But due to time and political instability, some were likely in short supply. Instead of layering the paint meticulously, the painters often applied one coat only, and they outlined entire scenes with thick black strokes to compensate for the lack of detail. There's no gilding, no lapis lazuli inlay, no time for embellishment. Everything had to work in one pass. The division of labor. More factory than temple tomb painting in ancient Egypt was highly organized, not a free-form act of creativity. And in this case, the process likely resembled a production line more than a divine ritual. First, senior artisan, possibly a master draftsman or a chief of the tomb, would sketch outlines in red ochre dot. Then another artisan, perhaps. Correction, master would trace adjustments in black. Painters would follow, working in small teams. One painted skin tones, one filled garments, another worked on hieroglyphs. Finally, someone would apply varnish or protective layers, though evidence suggests that in Tutankhamun's tomb, its final step was skipped. And throughout all this, the team worked in near darkness, using small oil lamps or reflected sunlight from polished copper mirrors. The heat, oppressive. The air, heavy with plaster dust and oil smoke. There was no luxury of fresh air, no space to step back and admire their work. Only deadlines, sacred ones. Why the imagery is so repetitive. Look at the north wall. Tutankhamun appears 3 times. Once greeted by the goddess Nut, once undergoing the opening of the mouth ceremony, once as Osiris, god of the afterlife, reborn. And yet, the face is the same in all 3. Not similar, identical. This isn't just artistic convention. It's efficiency. The same cartoon template, broad brow, sloping nose, full lips was likely reused with slight adjustments, whether the figure was a god, a priest, or a king. The features remained standardized in longer-lived tombs. Artists had the time to carve individuality. Here, they recycled faces. Why? Because any time spent revising details meant time not spent painting the next wall. And in their culture, a partially finished tomb was a spiritual disaster. If the afterlife scenes weren't fully rendered, the soul could be trapped, lost, or devoured by chaos. Better a simple scene than none at all. The political hand guiding the brush now asked this: who ordered the painters to work so quickly? Who controlled the rush? Most scholars point to I.K., the vizier who conducted Tutankhamun's burial and then became Pharaoh himself. I may have wanted the burial done swiftly to legitimize his claim to the throne. A proper funeral, performed publicly and in line with tradition, would tie him to the dead king's legacy. And what better way to do that than to be painted alongside Tutankhamun in the tomb? Indeed, some believe that I himself is the figure in the opening of the mouth ceremony, placing ritual tools on the mummy's face. That image is one of the few personal touches in the tomb. A quiet political move, painted in a hurry. The silence that followed once the painters left. The tomb was sealed, and then silence. Unlike other tombs, which were entered, robbed, repainted, and repurposed over centuries, Tutankhamun's was forgotten under rubble and later construction, which meant that the hasty brushstrokes, uneven pigments, fungal stains were preserved almost exactly as they were on the day the tomb was closed. No edits, no corrections, no restorations. The painter's decisions, made in urgency and sweat, survived undisturbed for over 3,000 years. When Carter opened the tomb, he found a golden coffin, a cursed rumor, and priceless treasures. But he also found a painter's panic, sealed in plaster. So pause again. Picture that last night, the plaster damped, the pigment drying unevenly. One artisan sits on a crate, rubbing red ochre between his fingers. Another wipes sweat from his brow with a cloth. Blackened by soot, they whisper about the future, about the rumors of Horemheb. They do not know that what they paint perfectly, hardly, will become the most famous royal burial in human history. They do not know that the corners they cut will someday become clues. They only know that the torch is burning low, and the wall still needs one more coat. If you were to stand inside Tutankhamun's burial chamber alone, no cameras, no tour guides, no velvet ropes, you might feel an odd kind of closeness. The room is not vast or majestic. It's quiet, intimate. The ceiling feels low. The walls, close to the breath. You could reach out and touch the scenes that once guided the king into the next world. You could run your fingers along brushstrokes meant to be seen by gods, not people. And if you knew what to look for, you let your eyes drift past the obvious golds and reds, you might start to see something else. Mistakes, edits, panic, and, behind it all, silence. A misstep in paintlit. Your gaze moved to the southern wall. This wall contains one of the most pivotal scenes in Egyptian burial art, Tutankhamun's transformation into the divine Osiris. But here, the composition tells a strange story. There are visible alterations beneath the final image, using infrared photography and X-ray fluorescence. Modern researchers have discovered that some figures were painted, scraped off, and painted again. Why would an artist remove and repaint a scene that was already finished? One theory is theological. Correction, perhaps. A detail was found to be heretical or incorrect according to ritual standards. Another, more telling theory is political editing. What if the figure wasn't always Tutankhamun? What if, before the burial was confirmed, this scene portrayed someone else entirely? Perhaps his successor or an unnamed high priest, Oct, or even a figure from Akhenaten's controversial court. There are no records to confirm it. Tears of pigment one buried beneath the others, just a change of mind, or more likely, a change in power. The paint was not sacred in itself. Only the version that survived the drying was meant to be eternal. The left-handed figure and the slanting foot scholars have long puzzled over a strange detail in one of the painted figures. In the opening of the mouth scene, where a figure touches ritual tools to the lips of Tutankhamun's mummy, the posture appears awkward. The left hand holds an object in a way that's rarely seen in Egyptian art, as if the figure is left-handed, though most are traditionally shown with dominance in the right. More curious still, the angle of the foot, it slants outward against canon.n temple art. Proportions were not optional. The grid system, used since the Old Kingdom, defined how a body should be painted: how many squares from the heel to the knee, how many from the elbow to the fingertips. A deviation could mean one of three things. The painter was untrained. The painter was in a rush. The figure was altered after the initial sketch. In the case of Tutankhamun's tomb, many believe it was the third. Someone, perhaps himself, inserted a figure into the painting, using a template that didn't quite match the original grid. The artisan corrected what he could, but the foot never quite aligned. The posture always looked just a little off. And so, thousands of years later, we stare at the misstep and ask, was this a rush correction? Or was it a symbol of something greater, an awkward moment in Egypt's royal succession, permanently sealed in the paint? Fungi that tell a story. The dark spots on the walls of the burial chamber were once thought to be nothing more than dirt. When Howard Carter opened the tomb in 1922, the spots were already present. They were noted, photographed, and largely ignored, but modern science gave them a second look. These are not stains. They are fungus blooms, a result of painting over wet plaster in a sealed tomb under intense humidity. Most curious of all, the fungi are dead. They grew rapidly during the months after the tomb was sealed, feeding on the organic materials in the pigment tag, white, plant resin, animal glue. Then, with no fresh air and no nutrients, they stopped. Their spores fossilized in place in their own quiet way. They confirm everything else we know. The tomb was painted on wet plaster. It was sealed too quickly, and the walls, while intended to last forever, began to decay almost immediately when nothing was written down there. No known records from the time of Tutankhamun's burial that describe who painted the walls. No names, no roles, no receipts for pigments or orders from the vizier. Unlike other tombs, where artists occasionally left signatures or dedications to the gods, Tutankhamun's tomb is blank. Why? Perhaps because it was unimportant at the time. He was a minor king a young boy who died before his rule could shape Egypt. His tomb was treated accordingly, respectful, yes, but not immortalized, or perhaps the silence was deliberate. The years after Akhenaten's reign were marked by historical erasure. Names of heretics were chiseled out. Temples were repainted. Even royal records were rewritten. In that atmosphere, to leave a name behind was dangerous. The painters may have been told, "Do your work and be forgotten," and so they were. Until a British archaeologist, 3,000 years later, shone a torch on their brushstrokes. The silence of the ceiling of the burial chamber is painted a deep, star-speckled blue, a nod to Nut, goddess of the sky. It is one of the few places in the tomb where no figures appear. No gods, no humans, just the night. Why? Perhaps they ran out of time. Perhaps the plan had been to paint constellations, or solar boats, or the rebirth of Ra. But instead, the blue stretches unbroken, like a desert sky, untouched by clouds. Some see it as laziness, others see it as reverence, a minimalist gesture in an otherwise crowded tomb. But either way tells the truth. The ceiling was likely the last part painted, and by then there was no room left for time, or paint, or ambition. Only a blue that might be mistaken for silence. What? The tomb teaches us about time in the end. Tutankhamun's tomb was never meant to last. It was a temporary measure, a rushed compromise, a half-formed answer to an unexpected death. And yet, of all the pharaohs, his is the only tomb found nearly intact. Because of the rush. It was sealed in obscurity. Because of its obscurity, it was protected from looters. Because of its simplicity, it was passed over by thieves. And because of its survival, it became the most famous tomb in history. The artisans who painted those walls likely thought. Shortcuts they took. They may have walked away thinking their brushstrokes would be covered, or cracked, or stolen. But they were wrong. The imperfections made the tomb invisible, and the invisibility made it eternal. So, if you find yourself in a museum one day, standing before a replica of that golden burial chamber, pause. Don't just admire the color, the gold, the boy-king. Look closer. See the brushstroke that missed its line, the pigment that bled into wet plaster, the eye that's just slightly too large. And remember, somewhere in a dusty corner of the necropolis, a painter set down his brush, wiped his hand on a linen cloth, and walked out into the desert. He had finished the wall, and in doing so, had unknowingly painted his name into history. The Valley of the Kings is not quiet by accident. Even today, if you stand there just after sunrise, before the buses arrive, before the heat rises from the earth and the footsteps of tourists echo off the limestone walls, the silence feels deliberate. Every breeze between the hills sounds like breath through stone. Every crack in the earth feels like it's watching you in this dry, grave-strewn valley. Over 60 royal tombs are carved deep into the rock. Some twist far into the mountain. Some have corridors so long they feel like journeys of their own. Some were left incomplete. Some were robbed bare. Some were never even used. And then there's KV 62, Tutankhamun's tomb. It is small, it is awkwardly shaped. Its layout does not follow traditional design. Its decoration is minimal, and it may never have been intended for a pharaoh at all. In this section, we will walk slowly through the forgotten blueprint of KV6 tooth and narrow corridors, the hastily plastered walls, the strange shifts in geometry, and try to understand why the most famous tomb in history may have been, quite simply, a reused mistake. A layout that makes no sense in the New Kingdom. Royal tombs followed a consistent architectural formula: a long entrance ramp, a sloped corridor, few chambers for ritual preparation. Then finally, a burial chamber beneath a mountain, lined with solar and celestial paths. Tutankhamun's tomb breaks the pattern entirely. It opens with a short, ascending corridor, then a small antechamber, then a burial chamber off to the right, not straight ahead, as would be typical for a king. To the side is a small room, likely a storage annex, and behind a sealed wall, another chamber, now called the treasury. And that's it. 4 rooms, cramped, unevenly spaced, misaligned with traditional cosmic orientations. Why? Egyptologists now believe KV62 was originally intended for someone else, someone minor, someone not royal, a noble, perhaps a priest, an advisor. Tutankhamun was buried there only because there was no time to build a proper tomb. The death no one expected Tutankhamun Sit came suddenly. He was probably around 18 or 19 years old. Theories abound: malaria, a broken leg, an inherited disease, complications from incestuous lineage. We don't know. What we do know is that his death disrupted everything. He had no heir. He had no planned tomb of his own. He had no surviving family member powerful enough to organize a full royal burial. So the court acted fast. They looked around the valley for a spare tomb, something already under construction, something close enough to completion to adapt. KV62 was chosen, probably because it was far along, hidden, and not yet claimed in that moment. A tomb that may have been meant for an anonymous noble became the final resting place for a king. But in that rush, cracks began to show, literally, the walls that Sweat Howard Carter noted upon opening the burial chamber in 1922. That the walls were unusually damp for the desert. Moisture had collected behind the paint. It had caused mold. Why? Because the plaster had not fully dried when it was painted. In normal royal tombs, artists had months, sometimes years, to complete wall paintings. The plaster would dry. Layers would be sealed with resin. Stakes would be fixed. But in Tutankhamun's tomb, the walls were still wet when the pigments were applied. Some colors ran, some dried unevenly, and when the tomb was sealed and the humidity inside rose, fungus began to grow. The black spots you could still see on the burial chamber walls. They are fossilized evidence of the rush. The mismatched items, the funerary goods buried with Tutankhamun, tell their own story of chaos. Among the 5,000 objects found were canopic shrines far too large for the room. They were placed in a chariot that appeared damaged before burial statues, whose inscriptions were either rushed or incomplete items clearly made for someone else, with names scratched out and replaced. Many objects in the tomb bear the names of other royals, especially female names. Some believe that Queen Nefertiti, or Meritant, or another royal woman, had originally commissioned items for her own burial. But when Tutankhamun died, those items were repurposed. Names were altered. Inscriptions were shaved off. Gold was polished. The afterlife, it seems, could be recycled. A coffin with the wrong face, perhaps. The most telling clue that Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't his comes from the coffin itself. Tutankhamun was buried in 3 nested coffins, the outer to appear to have been hastily repurposed, but the innermost coffin, made of solid gold, is unusual. The facial features do not quite match other depictions of Tutankhamun. The earrings are pierced in a way consistent with royal women, not men. In the original, inlaid inscriptions appear to have been altered. Some scholars now believe this inner coffin was made for someone else entirely, perhaps Nefertiti. If that is true, it suggests something more than a rushed burial. It suggests a deliberate reshuffling of royal resources, with little regard for consistency. A scramble, a crisis. The reverse orientation, not the oddity, lies in the tomb's axis. Most royal tombs face east to west, symbolizing the journey of the sun god Ra through the underworld. Tutankhamun's tomb runs north to south. This may seem minor, but in ancient Egyptian cosmology, orientation mattered deeply. The journey through the afterlife was not symbolic, it was mapped. To build a tomb against tradition meant disturbing the metaphysical balance of rebirth. Some believe this was simply unavoidable due to the valley's geography. Others believe it was another sign of last-minute repurposing, that the tomb's original occupant was not expected to follow the solar path of the pharaohs. The hidden doorways in 2015. Radar scans revealed possible hidden chambers behind the tomb's north wall. Speculation exploded. Were there secret rooms? Was Nefertiti buried beyond that wall? Is Tutankhamun's tomb just a small part of a much larger complex? Excavations since then have yielded mixed results. Some scans were inconclusive. Others showed signs of rough cavities, but no accessible chambers. Still, the idea remains. KV-62 might have been carved as an annex to a larger tomb, not as a primary burial site. If that's true, then Tutankhamun's tomb isn't just reused, it's unfinished. A burial of convenience. Perhaps the most sobering detail of all is this: Tutankhamun's name was nearly forgotten. His tomb remained sealed, but no great temple was built in his honor. No monumental inscription was carved in his memory. His successor placed his own name over Tutankhamun's in several places, co-opting his legacy. Horemheb, the next pharaoh, tried to erase all traces of the Amarna period, including Tutankhamun, for 3,000 years. His name disappeared from history only when Carter found the tomb. In 1922 was it spoken again by the world, and yet none of it would have happened had that misfit tomb not been available, had KV-62 not existed in quiet obscurity. Obscurity absorbed a king it was never meant to hold. By the time the first golden glint of Tutankhamun's burial mask was revealed beneath the sand and plaster in 1922, the world had already started to form an idea of what Egyptian royalty should look like. Lavish, grand, monumental. But inside this tiny tomb, what Carter found wasn't just gold or jewels. It was contradiction. It was compromise. It was the most famous king in modern history, buried in what looks like a forgotten storeroom. As we move deeper into the details of KV-62, what we find are not only oddities in architecture, but quiet clues in the tools and textures left behind in finished surfaces, corrected inscriptions, broken furniture. It's as though this burial was more a salvage operation than a state ritual. In this section, we'll explore what the materials themselves tell us about the tomb, the court, and the forgotten reality of what it meant to bury a pharaoh in crisis, the paint that shouldn't have dried. Let's start with the walls. In most New Kingdom royal tombs, the burial chamber walls are densely packed with scenes from the Amduat or the Book of Gates guides through the underworld that ensured the safe passage of the soul. These murals are rich in detail and often outlined in red or black ink before pigment was applied. Skilled artisans had months, even years, to complete them. Tutankhamun's burial chamber tells a very different story. There are only a few painted scenes, and most of them are concentrated on the north wall. These include depictions of Tutankhamun's successor performing the opening of the mouth ceremony. Another scene shows Tutankhamun being embraced by Osiris, the god of the afterlife. But these images are hurried, almost clumsy. The lines are thicker. The details lack depth. The scale of the figures is slightly off. Moreover, the technique is flat, not carved. Royal tombs usually featured reliefs carved into the stone and then painted. Tutankhamun's were painted directly onto a layer of plaster, much of which had not dried properly, as mentioned in Section 1. Dark fungal blotches still mar the walls, likely caused by the moisture trapped between the wet plaster and the sealed tomb. Conservationists note that these marks haven't spread in the last century, meaning the fungal growth happened soon after burial. The implication is unavoidable. These walls were painted hastily, perhaps in a matter of days. then sealed up quickly, allowing no time for the natural curing process. This isn't what you'd expect for a pharaoh. It's what you'd expect from a rushed repair job. A burial mask, not meant for him. One of the most iconic artifacts in the world, the burial mask of Tutankhamun, may not have been made for Tutankhamun at all. Let's look closer. The golden face is serene, symmetrical, almost impossibly smooth. The lapis lazuli inlays shimmer in the light, and the Ninnis headcloth is perfectly proportioned. But around the inlay of the name cartouche, careful metallurgic analysis has shown signs of soldering, where the original nameplate was replaced. Beneath the replacement, faint outlines suggest the mask may originally have borne the name of a queen. The pierced earlobes are another giveaway. Male royals were rarely depicted with pierced ears after childhood, but female royals were. The mask may have been created for a woman, possibly Nefertiti, then hastily repurposed for the boy king after his unexpected death. That kind of reuse was not just practical light, was politically necessary. By the time Tutankhamun died, the country had been through immense turmoil. His father, Akhenaten's religious revolution, had nearly collapsed the state. The power vacuum that followed left high officials scrambling. Reusing royal regalia, including burial gear, wasn't scandalous. It was efficient. And it may have been the only option. The shrines too big for the room inside the burial chamber. Series of 4 gilded wooden shrines encased the nested coffins. These shrines, like giant rectangular boxes, were meant to represent protective structures. Each one was supposed to fit cleanly inside the chamber and allow the ritual procession to move freely around them. But in Tutankhamun's tomb, the largest shrine was too big to fit through the corridor. The workmen had to cut away part of the wall leading into the burial chamber to slide it in. Then, once it was in place, they repaired the wall roughly and sealed the entrance. This again suggests that these shrines were not custom built for the space. They were already made perhaps for a different tomb and then adapted in panic. The innermost shrine was so tight against the chamber walls that there was no room for walking. This was highly unorthodox. Rituals during the burial required priests to circle the coffin and perform symbolic rites. In Tutankhamun's case, many of these rites may have been skipped entirely or adapted in the cramped conditions. Recycled furniture and scratched out names among the 5,000 objects found in the tomb. Many showed evidence of being reused from different time periods, different artistic styles, and even different ownership. Some wooden boxes had names of female royals erased and Tutankhamun's painted in. A ceremonial bed had animal legs, typical of the Amarna period, not the post-Amarna style of Tutankhamun's reign. Statues and Ushabti figures, small figurines meant to serve the king in the afterlife, were unfinished or mismatched. One shrine had an inscription hastily corrected, where A's name seemed to replace someone else's. These were not museum pieces, they were second-hand goods, retouched in a hurry. Even the sandals found in the tomb, beautifully detailed with scenes of the king trampling his enemies, were oddly unworn. Some still had rough-cut edges. They were meant for display, not use. It's possible they were made as stage props for a burial. No one had time to plan an unusual treasury. The chamber, labeled treasury, contained objects of stunning craftsmanship. A golden statue of Anubis on a shrine, alabaster jars, ornate chests. But even here, the quantity and scale were modest compared to other royal tombs. This treasury, likely carved as a side annex, had been transformed into a Kidshaw storage room. Items appeared to have been stacked without ceremony, with little concern for arrangement in a traditional royal burial. These items would be methodically placed based on ritual order. Jars of food for sustenance, tools for farming, scrolls of spells. In Kivi 6-2, the objects were placed where they would fit, not where they belonged. The result feels more like a makeshift storeroom than a sacred vault. Wooden coffins that splintered the outer coffins in Tutankhamun's tomb were made of gilded wood, not solid gold. Though beautiful, these coffins showed cracks and signs of repair, even before their burial. One theory suggests these coffins were leftover stock made for another royal and altered later. Inscriptions were shaved off and reinscribed. Decorative patterns didn't quite match from one layer to the next. The lids sat unevenly, gold leaf peeled in corners. Carter's team, during the excavation, noted the fragility of these outer coffins. Unlike the durable sarcophagi of other pharaohs, Tutankhamun's wooden containers were susceptible to decay. Why? Possibly because time was running out. The religious calendar dictated certain burial windows. Missing them could result in metaphysical failure to reach the afterlife. The court may have chosen speed over durability, a compromise that now gives us forensic clues. The politics of a funeral name that appears again and again is Tutankhamun's vizier and possibly his successor, is depicted in the tomb performing funerary rituals that were typically done by the next of kin, usually a royal son. But Tutankhamun had no heir. Seizing the opportunity, may have performed the ritual to legitimize his claim to the throne. This would explain why he features so prominently, while Tutankhamun's widow, Tutankhamun, is entirely absent. If true, this would mean that the funeral itself was as much a political performance as a spiritual one. By burying the young king, was also burying the Amarna legacy, wrapping up a troubled chapter in Egyptian history, while opening his own. The forgotten years. Between walls. When you walk through KV62, it's easy to focus on the gold, the mask, the mystery. But perhaps the most telling secret is how ordinary so many of these details are. Unfinished walls, repurposed furniture with nicks and flaws, paintings with drips, carvings that were never completed. This isn't just a tomb of a pharaoh, it's the tomb of an administrative system under stress, a society scrambling to hold on to tradition while fighting collapse. And maybe that's why Tutankhamun's tomb is so fascinating. Not because it's perfect, but because it shows us what happens when perfection breaks down, when the rituals of kingship are shoved into spaces not meant to hold them. And so we ask, what else in Egypt's grand history is being hidden by surface perfection? And what forgotten truths lie beneath the paint? The burial of Tutankhamun, often portrayed as a glittering triumph of ancient craftsmanship, was in truth a patchwork, a hurried, imperfect final resting place for a boy king who ruled too briefly and died too suddenly. What came after his burial, however, is just as revealing. For the third and final section of this story, we turn not to the items that went into the tomb, but to what happened once the lid was closed, the chamber sealed, and the memory of Tutankhamun carefully reshaped by the men who came after. What did they do with his name, his legacy, his memory, and why, despite the wealth of artifacts recovered, was there so little recorded of his reign until the tomb was found? What follows is the quiet disappearance of a king and how one of the most elaborate tombs in history remained hidden for over 3,000 years, largely because it was never meant to be remembered. The vanishing king after Tutankhamun died around 1323 BCE. The Egypt he left behind was bruised and unsteady. His reign had only just begun to patch over the disastrous reign of his father Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who had declared that Egypt would worship only Aten, the sun disk, dismantling a pantheon that had existed for centuries. Tutankhamun had reversed those policies. He reopened the temples of Amun, moved the capital back to Thebes, and tried quietly to restore what his father had broken. But his reign lasted barely a decade, left no heir and no monumental building projects to ensure his name lived on. The result, his name was omitted from king lists. His statues were dismantled or repurposed, and slowly he was forgotten. We know now that this erasure was intentional. It wasn't just time that wore his memory away, it was policy. By the time the 19th dynasty took power just a few decades later, Tutankhamun was little more than a historical footnote. Ramses I, Seti I, Ramses II, these were the builders of empire. They had no interest in honoring a king whose family name was associated with religious upheaval. The house of Akhenaten was to be erased, and so the tomb of Tutankhamun, modest, cramped, barely adequate, was left untouched, because to touch it would mean remembering a past that no one wanted to remember. How the tomb was forgotten is easy to imagine. That a chamber full of gold and painted walls would stand out in a rocky desert valley. But the Valley of the Kings is deceptive. Over the centuries, floods carried silt and rock through the narrow gullies of the necropolis. Each flood deposited more debris. By the 11th century BCE, when workmen carved the tomb of Ramses VI, they dumped their construction rubble right over the entrance of KV62. This tomb, perhaps already forgotten, was now physically buried, and it stayed that way for over 3,000 years. Grave robbers broke into other royal tombs. Priests relocated mummies for protection. Kings' names were listed and relisted, but Tutankhamun's name wasn't mentioned. Wasn't looted because no one could find it. It was an accident of architecture and erasure that turned it into the most famous archaeological find in history. Even during the great wave of 19th century Egyptomania, when European explorers raced to uncover the past, KV62 remained elusive. Howard Carter, working under Lord Carnarvon, had spent years digging in the valley. He knew there had to be more. And in 1922, when a water boy stumbled across a stone step buried under a layer of dust and rubble, the forgotten tomb was finally remembered. But even then, its location hinted at its hasty creation. KV62 lies directly below the entrance of Ramses VI tomb, location no architect would have chosen for a proper pharaoh. It's possible the tomb originally belonged to a noble or a minor royal, hastily repurposed when the young king died. That it survived untouched wasn't a triumph of secrecy. It was a byproduct of neglect, a legacy crafted by foreign hands. Most pharaohs planned for the afterlife from the moment they ascended the throne. They commissioned mortuary temples, colossal statues, entire valleys of stone to house their memory. Tutankhamun's tomb has none of that. Its legacy, as we know it today, was entirely shaped by 20th century eyes. It was Carter and Carnarvon's discovery and the world's appetite for mystery that made Tutankhamun a household name. Newspapers in London and New York published breathless reports of the discovery. Photographs of the mask and coffin graced magazine covers. The rumors of a curse only added to the public fascination. But none of this was Tutankhamun's doing. The boy king, in life, had been a restoration figurehead, ruled by viziers like I and Horemheb. He died suddenly. He left no temple, no children, no grand battle victories. Yet, in death through photography, exhibitions, and museum tours, he became Egypt's best-known pharaoh. It's one of history's quietest ironies. King, who was erased, became the only one no one could forget. The tomb that said too little and too much. When we look at the burial chamber walls, we see fewer than a dozen painted figures. Compare that with the tombs of Seti I or Ramses III, where entire theological texts are painted floor to ceiling. Why the difference? Time and secrecy. KV62's decoration is limited to only one chamber, and even there, the scenes are strangely impersonal. The opening of the mouth ritual, performed by I, gives us more information about the politics of succession than about the life of the boy it was meant to commemorate. The image of Osiris embracing Tutankhamun seems standardized, without the intricate detail found in other tombs. The other walls are almost blank, not incomplete, simply omitted. This tomb was not designed to tell a story. It was built to get the job done. Its silence speaks volumes about the panic, uncertainty, and exhaustion that marked the final years of the 18th dynasty. What the tomb never got to say had Tutankhamun lived longer. Had he ruled into adulthood, we might have had a mortuary temple, a royal decree, a temple wall inscription describing his victories or divine claims. Instead, we're left with fragments, a throne with delicate gold inlay showing the young king being anointed by his queen, a few statues of him as a child god, a papyrus-wrapped chariot that was never ridden. Objects speak, but only in whispers. Historians must reconstruct a life from absence as much as presence. From what's missing in the tomb, no mention of Akhenaten, no mention of Nefertiti, no explanation for why certain items were clearly intended for someone else. Even the cartouches are sometimes scratched out and re-etched, suggesting that the question of who Tutankhamun wasn't, how he should be remembered, was still being argued even as the burial was underway. Was it ever his tomb at all? This leads to the final, and perhaps most quietly devastating question. Was KV-62 ever really meant to be Tutankhamun's tomb? Or was it simply available? Some scholars believe that another, grander tomb was started elsewhere, but not completed in time. There are clues in nearby tombs and finished corridors, half-carved chambers that suggest preparations may have been made for someone else. But Tutankhamun's death was sudden. He may have died from an infected wound, a congenital illness, or an accident, with little time to prepare. The court reused what they could find. That would explain why the tomb is so small for a king, why the wall paintings are so few, why the objects are mismatched and clearly borrowed, why the tomb was so easily forgotten. In other words, KB-62 was not just a burial site, it was a solution. The lasting question today: millions know the name Tutankhamun. His golden mask is reproduced in textbooks, documentaries, and souvenirs. But for the people of his time, he was a temporary king, bridging the gap between a heretic father and a powerful military general. And for centuries after, he was nothing. No one built monuments in his name. No one told stories of his conquests. No one lit incense at his tomb. It was only by accidental sealed door, a sand-covered step, a forgotten pile of rubble, that his memory returned. And so, we're left to wonder, how many other rulers, lives, or stories lie buried beneath modern sand and silt? Not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. You're walking down a stone corridor, quiet and cool, despite the weight of the desert above. The air is still. Walls rise up on either side, colored with ochre, gold, lapis, and faded black. They don't shimmer, not anymore. They whisper. Every figure has eyes, and every eye seems to follow you. But some of those eyes are off, slightly misaligned. Others are missing detail. A god's foot fades into the yellow wall behind him. A servant's hands float in space, disconnected from his robes. Some hieroglyphs are cut deep and crisp. Others are rushed, shallow, slanted, squeezed into tight margins, as though someone forgot. They were supposed to be there. This is not the tomb of a mighty king who had decades to prepare. This is the work of an overworked, under-directed team of artists working under a ticking clock. The question is, why? A paintbrush without time in the traditional tombs of great Egyptian pharaohs. The art tells the story of the king's journey to the afterlife, how he is transformed into Osiris, how he navigates the 12 hours of night, how he defends himself in the halls of judgment before the gods, how he reaches the field of reeds, a paradise of eternal harvests. That journey requires space, and time, and planning in Tutankhamun's tomb. KV-62, only one chamber is painted, the burial chamber, and even this space is modest, with 3 walls bearing decoration, and one oddly left bare, apart from its golden shrine. It's tempting to think this choice was symbolic, but in reality, it was probably just practical. The king had died suddenly, and the tomb, originally meant for someone else, had to be finished before decay set in. Ancient Egyptian embalming slowed decomposition, but the process wasn't indefinite. Within 70 days, burial was expected, so the artisans, a team of scribes, painters, and plasterers from Deir el-Medina, were summoned, and they did what they could. Deir el-Medina, the town of royal artistes. Artists weren't anonymous. They lived in a purpose-built village on the west bank of the Nile, near the Valley of the Kings. Deir el-Medina was a community of state employees, stonemasons, painters, draftsmen, and sculptors, with families, wages, and even labor strikes when their rations were delayed, from astraca and graffiti found in their homes. We know their names: Peshedo, Kenherkapshef, Senajum. They worked on royal tombs for decades. They passed their skills from father to son, but even they couldn't do miracles. When summoned to decorate KV62, the time constraints were punishing. They had to adapt. Here's how: plaster, pigment, and pressure in most royal tombs. Walls were carefully smoothed, then coated with multiple layers of fine plaster. Draftsmen would sketch outlines in red ochre. A senior scribe would correct the lines in black, and painters would then fill in the figures. In KV62, this process was abbreviated. The plaster was thin, uneven in places. It had to dry quickly. In one section, modern analysis shows that the paint was applied before the plaster was fully dry, causing the pigments to bleed. In another, a god's arm vanishes into a patch of unworked wall, as though the artisan was called away before finishing. Infrared and UV scans have also revealed revisions, a sign that figures were moved, resized, or redrawn hastily. In one case, an image of eye performing a funerary rite may have originally been intended to depict someone else. The colors are traditional: yellow skin for men, white for linen, green for Osiris, but the finish is crude. For other tombs, feature shading, depth, and intricate patterns on collars and scepters. Tutankhamun's burial chamber is flat, almost cartoonish, and this flatness has led to centuries of misunderstanding. Misread symbols, hidden clues for years. Scholars took the art of KV62 at face value, but a closer look reveals a layered story of repurposing and misdirection. Let's consider the West Wall, for example. It shows Tutankhamun in the presence of Osiris, but look closer and you'll see that the facial features are generic. The cartouches bearing his name were likely added after the painting was finished. The face could have belonged to anyone. This wall had been painted before the decision was made to bury Tutankhamun here. It's not impossible. Similarly, on the north wall, its eye is shown performing the opening of the mouth ritual, a key step in restoring the senses of the deceased. But the figure labeled as eye bears a suspicious resemblance to the young king himself. Was this image altered to reflect the change in succession? Stakes add to the mystery. A hieroglyphic spelling of Osiris contains an incorrect glyph, a common one for Ka, the life force. Was this a simple scribe error, or was a worker carving by memory without the proper reference? When art is rushed, clarity suffers, but so does truth. Telltale mold. The sweat of the painters when Carter first opened the tomb in 1922. He noticed patches of dark mold on the painted walls, speckled, circular blooms that marred the yellow plaster. Modern microbiologists studied the stains. They weren't recent, they were ancient. This mold likely grew during the drying process when the tomb was sealed, still humid with the breath and sweat of dozens of workers finishing their jobs. The dampness of the paint, combined with the still air of the sealed tomb, created the perfect incubator, and because the walls were sealed within days of the king's burial, the mold remained frozen in time, a biosignature of a rushed job. This tiny detail tells us more than words ever could. It means the tomb was painted days or hours before burial. It confirms that speed was not just a factor. It was the dominating force. Who painted the walls? And who gave the orders? This question remains murky. Normally, a chief artist, perhaps the overseer of tomb workers, would oversee the layout. But in KV62, the structure was so small and hurried that it may have fallen to just a handful of craftsmen, likely under direct orders from the vizier I. Who would crown himself king shortly after Tutankhamun's burial, had every reason to control the narrative. He needed legitimacy. Painting himself on the wall, conducting the sacred rituals, was not just a tradition, it was a declaration. He was pharaoh now, and the boy king's story, whatever it had been, was over. The forgotten signatures, some tombs. Artists left tiny marks, a name scratched into a beam, a doodle behind a pillar, a joke written in ink. KV62 is largely silent. No builder's graffiti has been found. No doodles in the plaster. No playful sketches in the storage rooms. This absence is telling. It suggests an atmosphere, not of reverence, but urgency. There was no time for pride, just a deadline, just a body waiting for a resting place. When perfection wasn't the point. So, what does this teach us? That even in the most iconic of ancient tombs, the artistry was not always about glory. Sometimes it was about obligation. A life had ended. A burial had to happen. The people responsible did what they could with what they had in the time they were given. And through all of that, they still left something behind. A wall that cracks. A god's foot that's missing. Conscious. Scratched 2SHLLOWLY.U. Standing there 3,000 years later. Notice these things. And in noticing, you hear them. The whispers of the artists of Deir el-Medina. Painting by torchlight. Racing against decay. It's decay. If you listen carefully, in the stillness of that tomb, just beyond the golden shrine, it's past the wall where Osiris stares forward in eternal silence. There's another sound, faint, muffled, almost forgotten. It's not divine, it's human. Swish of horsehair brushes in wet plaster. The scrape of reed pens across limestone. The labored breath of men working by oil lamp light, whispering instructions in the narrow space. And beyond that, the subtle creak of administration. Orders passed, deadlines whispered. The pressure of a burial forced into fast forward. There's no record of the exact moment the artists entered Tutankhamun's burial chamber. No inscription, noting the day the first color was applied. But the brushstrokes remain. So do the choices they made. Some deliberate, some desperate. And in those choices is a silent archive of what happens when Egypt's most sacred ritual is turned into a rush job. Why the tomb was never finished. Tutankhamun died around 1323 BCE, likely aged 19. And while his death was unexpected, the failure to plan for it wasn't entirely unusual. Pharaohs were supposed to begin their tombs early in life, but Tutankhamun had only ruled for 9 years. He had come to power as a child. Much of his reign had been shaped by advisors, priests, and the lingering shadow of his father. Akhenaten. And the truth is, his tomb wasn't ready. KV62 was not designed for a king. It was a small tomb, likely intended for a noble or minor royal. It had a basic layout: antechamber, annex, burial chamber, and treasury. No long corridors, no pillared halls, no sunken shrines or vast sarcophagi chambers, but it would have to do. Why not just wait and build a proper one? That was never an option. You see, in Egyptian belief, the soul, the Ka, and the Ba needed to be reconnected to the body through ritual, sealing, and burial. This process could not be delayed indefinitely. 70 days was the traditional period, aligning with the embalming process. Any longer, and the king's soul might wander, unable to reach the afterlife. Time was running out, so the tomb was sealed while it was still incomplete. But it wasn't just the structure that was rushed, the art suffered too. A wall meant for eternity, painted in paniclettes take a closer look at the north wall. Teeth, the one directly facing the burial chamber's entrance. It's the most visually complex wall, the only one to depict a funeral ritual scene from left to right. It shows 3 major episodes. Tutankhamun greeting the goddess Nut, who stretches her arms to welcome him. The king in his divine form, embraced by Osiris. I, the high priest and future king, performing the opening of the mouth's ritual on Tutankhamun's wrapped mummy. But the style is inconsistent. The heads are disproportionate. The outlines, usually so precise in royal tombs, wobble here and there. The spacing between figures is uneven. Eye seems awkwardly crammed into the edge of the panel, as though the original layout didn't account for him. Pigment analysis shows that the yellow used for flesh tones was applied quickly, without layering. The result is patchy, thin in places, over-thick in others. The black outline, made from carbon-based ink, sometimes bled into the surrounding plaster. It's likely because it was applied too early, before the wall had fully dried. And then there's the issue of fingerprints. Yes, fingerprints. Microscopic scans of the painted surface show smudged marks in some areas, likely from handlers repositioning themselves or nudging the surface to adjust a stencil. These shouldn't exist in a finished tomb, but in KV-62, they're preserved like ghostly echoes of the hands that worked under pressure. The ghost tomb, was it built for someone else? An old but persistent theory suggests that KV-62 may have originally been intended for someone other than Tutankhamun, perhaps Queen Nefertiti. Why? Because the layout, orientation, and even some stylistic features appear feminine. The direction of the burial chamber is unusual for a king. It's aligned to the east, not the traditional west. Tombs for queens during the late 18th dynasty often had this layout. In addition, certain sections of the wall painting appear to have been altered. Infrared scans show underdrawings that don't perfectly match the final images, almost like drafts that were corrected with overlays of paint. Could the burial chamber have been halfway decorated for another occupant? And when the boy king died, was the work abruptly halted, reoriented, and repainted? So, that would explain a great deal, especially the peculiar inclusion of eye performing sacred rites. A scene usually reserved for the deceased's heir or son. I had no familial claim to Tutankhamun, less of course he was rewriting the script with paint.color as a political, but ancient Egyptian art was never just decoration. It was spellwork.color, wasn't chosen arbitrarily. It was tied to meaning. Yellow represented the skin of God's eternal, untarnished. Green stood for fertility, regeneration, and Osiris. Red was power, chaos, or blood, depending on context. Blue conveyed the heavens, the Nile, and rebirth. Black was the color of the fertile soil of the Nile, symbolic of rebirth. Not death, but in KV-62, these meanings seem to blur. In some areas, blue is used inconsistently. Green is used where black might be expected. Red appears on skin that should have been yellow. Were these deliberate choices or accidents of haste? Chemical analysis shows that some pigments used in the tomb were lower quality substitutes. Egyptian blue, a rare synthetic pigment, is absent. Red ochre and carbon black are present, but in coarse form, suggests the team didn't have time to wait for premium supplies. They used what was immediately available. Even paint became a casualty of time. The burial chamber's silent corner. There's a strange detail in the burial chamber. One wall is completely unpainted. It's the eastern wall facing the sarcophagus. No gods, no hieroglyphs. Just smooth yellowish plaster. Why? One theory is that this wall was meant to be painted, perhaps with Tutankhamun's journey through the Amduat, the book of the underworld, but the artists ran out of time. Another theory holds that the wall was never intended to be painted because it backed up against solid rock. and would have been difficult to work on. But here's the twist. There may be a hidden doorway behind it. Radar scans conducted in 2015 suggested the presence of voids behind the wall, possibly hidden chambers. Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves proposed that these might be sealed corridors from an earlier tomb, perhaps even the final resting place of Nefertiti. So is the wall unfinished or hiding something? The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities remains cautious. Excavation is delicate, and the last thing they want is to damage the only intact royal tomb ever found. But the silence of that wall grows louder with time. The dust settled. The questions never did when the tomb was finally sealed. Likely just days after the paint dried, the workmen of Deir el-Medina packed their brushes, rolled up their stencils, and returned home. They left behind not a masterpiece, but a placeholder, a patchwork tomb for a forgotten boy. And yet, it is the most famous tomb in the world. Its very flaws, the rushed lines, smeared paint, the cramped figures, are what preserved it. The robbers didn't find it. Later, tomb builders didn't break into it. And when Howard Carter entered in 1922, everything was still there, because nobody thought this tomb was worth stealing. And that, ironically, is what saved it. What is the value of imperfect beauty? When you stand in the burial chamber today, behind the glass that protects the paint, you see not the glory of a mighty empire, but its vulnerability, a rushed burial, a team of tired men doing their best, a priest and pharaoh trying to rewrite his place in history with a brushstroke, and a wall that still hasn't spoken its final secret. Let's stand still in the burial chamber again. The colors may have dimmed, but they haven't vanished. The lines might waver, but they haven't crumbled. Time, with all its sweeping power, has been more patient with this little tomb than it was with the kings who ruled great palaces. The final story of Tutankhamun's Kanat tomb is not just a record of what was rushed, altered, or hidden. It's also a lesson in what wasn't said, and perhaps what couldn't be said. This room, this box of yellow gold plaster in divine iconography, is not only a burial site, 'tis a silence preserved in dust, silence of political uncertainty, of religious reversal, of anxious scribes and overwhelmed artisans who had to create something that would last forever, just a few short weeks. And in what they painted and what they didn't, we began to glimpse the undercurrent of fear, pressure, forgotten intention that shaped Tutankhamun's death more than any grand vision of eternity. The politics they couldn't paint by the time Tutankhamun died. Egypt had just emerged from one of its most destabilizing religious upheavals, the Amarna period, ruled by his probable father or half-brother, Akhenaten. Akhenaten had attempted a monotheistic revolution. He had sidelined the old gods in favor of Aten, the sun disk, Ka, dismantled the authority of the priesthoods, especially the powerful clergy of Amen. Temples were closed. Iconography was smashed. Keys were stripped of their wealth. But Akhenaten died. His successors, possibly including Nefertiti and a short-lived pharaoh named Smenkhare, disappeared from history's written line. Then came Tutankhamun. As a boy king, Tutankhamun had little power. His advisors, especially the vizier, and the general Horemheb, orchestrated a careful restoration. The old gods returned. The name of Amen was reinstated. Even Tutankhamun's own name was changed from Tutankhamun to Tutankhamun, signaling allegiance to the former gods. But this wasn't a smooth process. It was political theater, and his tomb paintings reflected not by what they show, but by what they don't. There are no references to 18 here. None to the religious conflict that had defined the last 20 years of Egyptian rule. Not a single trace of the boy kings. Controversial heritage is acknowledged in the iconography that surrounds his body. Instead, the tomb is flooded with traditional gods. Nut on the ceiling, Osiris on the north wall, Anubis crouched on a funerary shrine in the antechamber, Horus, Thoth, Hathor, Manat, all carefully positioned to reinforce the old ways, the pre-Amarna theology, as if to reassure not just the dead king, but all who would one day enter. We are loyal. We have returned. The disruption is gone. This wasn't just art. It was statecraft in pigment and plaster. The men behind the brushes, we do not know the names of the artists who painted Tutankhamun's burial chamber. No stela records their identities. No diary of Dr. el-Medina. Workers' lists who was assigned to KV62, but their fingerprints are there literally. More than a dozen unique fingerprints and palm impressions have been identified in the plaster layers and paint smudges of the tomb. Each print is a trace of a life, a hand, a motion. Not a scribe or a noble, but a laborer, a painter, someone who had been taught since youth to reproduce figures according to fixed canon, proportions, colors, poses, all regulated by generations of tradition. And yet, here, in this tomb, they rushed. There are places where the red grid lines, normally erased after the painting process, are still visible beneath the figures. Mistakes in proportions. Tutankhamun's feet are sometimes smaller than A's, though he's supposed to be the larger figure. Gods crowd around corners, awkwardly squeezed. Some panels, outlines are doubled, as though one artist started drawing, stopped, and another corrected it quickly. Why? Because they were working against the sun. Once the burial was scheduled, within the 70-day embalming ritual, the tomb had to be completed, and the workers knew it wasn't a royal tomb like any other. This was an embarrassment, a mikdoum, burial for a pharaoh who had no grand plan. They weren't building something to be admired. They were covering up a crisis, a sacred silence. The undecorated room in most New Kingdom tombs. The entire space is covered in texts, spells from the Amduat, the Book of Gates, or the Litany of Ra. These were guides for the soul, visual maps, for the dead king to navigate the 12 hours of the night and emerge. Renewed, Tutankhamun's tomb has none of these texts. Only the burial chamber was painted. The annex, treasury, and antechamber were left blank. Not a single line of hieroglyphs appears in those rooms. No maps, no spells, just plain walls. Some suggest the walls were too rough. Others say they planned to paint them later. But that never happened. This silence, this undecorated emptiness, is as loud as the gods painted on the chamber wall. It tells us that the burial was provisional. It tells us that the project was never completed, even symbolically. It tells us that Tutankhamun's journey through the afterlife was launched with half the map missing. And yet, the tomb worked despite its flaws. The burial protected the king's body, preserved thousands of objects, remained hidden for more than 3,000 years. Sometimes, a rushed job endures longer than a masterpiece. The hidden door, still a mystery. Let us return to the north wall. 4 years. Scholars have speculated that behind this painted surface, behind the image of Osiris embracing Tutankhamun, there may lie another chamber. In 2015, radar scans conducted by Japanese technician Hirokazu Watanabe suggested anomalies behind the plaster voids. Perhaps a corridor, maybe a doorway. Nicholas Reeves theorized that this might be the entrance to an earlier tomb, possibly that of Nefertiti, whose burial site has never been found. Further scans in 2016 and 2018 offered conflicting interpretations. Some suggested the anomalies were natural variations in the rock. Others believed the door may have been sealed and plastered deliberately to hide the adjacent space. Still, no excavation has occurred. Egyptian officials remain cautious. Cutting into the painted wall could destroy the only intact royal tomb ever discovered. And so, the mystery remains sealed, possibly forever, if there is something hidden there. The wall doesn't say, it only waits. The room that changed the world for all its imperfections. Tutankhamun's tomb changed the modern understanding of Egypt. Its discovery in 1922, with its golden mask, nested shrines, and untouched contents captured global imagination. It launched Tutmania in the 1920s. It shaped museum exhibitions for a century. It made Howard Carter famous. But few people realize just how unusual this tomb is, not for its treasures, but for its silence. It is not a grand theological statement. It is not a literary masterpiece in paint and stone. It is a stopgap, a compromise, a small tomb filled with big anxiety. And that, perhaps, is what makes it so powerful, because it reminds us that history is rarely made in perfect conditions. It is made in haste, in fear, in errors, in cover-ups, in 1,000 unrecorded decisions, and in the hurried swish of a brush. What else did they know and decide not to paint? We will never know what the artists were told, whether they were instructed to avoid 18 symbols, whether they quietly removed earlier figures beneath new paint, whether they knew the full story of the king they were burying. But we know what they left: a wall of gods, some too cramped to move, a blank room, empty of spells, a possible doorway sealed forever, and a single scene, the high priest, performing the most sacred of rites. That may have been more about politics than faith. Maybe that's what the tomb was always meant to preserve: not beauty, not power, but doubt and silence. In the heart of the Valley of the Kings, where stone corridors sink into ancient dust and the cliffs glow with mourning silence, there once worked a man whose name you've never heard. You've never seen his face, and likely never will. Behind no statue, no tomb with a painted ceiling, no funerary texts carved on limestone steely, no golden mask, no hieroglyphs proclaiming his lineage or his loyalty to a king. And yet, you've seen his work, or rather, you've seen where his work ends. You've seen the quiet curve of a god's arm painted in faded ochre. You've seen the way blue pigment laps unevenly at the edge of a falcon's wing. You've seen the empty space to where a figure should have stood, but didn't. These are his fingerprints, in a way, not the polished legacies of priests or pharaohs, but the traces of an ordinary artist whose hands may have held one of the last brushes in the rush to paint. Tutankhamun's tomb. No one recorded his name, but his work or his absence speaks across time, and that silence begins in the yellow walls of a burial chamber meant to last forever, where a face should have been. There's a strange anomaly in Tutankhamun's burial chamber, easy to miss unless you're searching. It's not a missing treasure or a sealed-off room. It's a face, or, more precisely, the absence of one on the western wall of the tomb. In a funerary scene believed to depict the solar bark and the 12 baboons of the night hours, one of the baboon figures has a blurred or missing face. The rest are clear, if somewhat hurried in their execution. But this one, the seventh from the left, is smudged. It's not by time or decay, but seemingly in the process of painting. Was it a mistake? Did the artist pause mid-brushstroke, or did someone wipe it off? To an untrained eye, it may seem insignificant, but in ancient Egyptian funerary art, completeness was sacred. Every limb, every feature, every god's headdress had to be intact, not just for artistic purposes, but for spiritual survival. A missing eye was not just an error. It was a disruption in the afterlife journey. So why would this baboon remain faceless? Some scholars have speculated that the artist left it unfinished. Others wonder if it had been erased. And others still believe it may have been a mark of haste, a scene executed so quickly that fidelity to canon gave way to the urgent ticking of time. But there's another possibility. What if the missing face wasn't an oversight? What if it was a quiet rebellion? The invisible artisan, like the well-documented scribes and overseers of tomb construction. The artisans who painted the tombs of kings remain largely anonymous. They were not slaves, as once imagined, but trained workers, often hereditary. Craftsmen from Deir el-Medina, the workers' village across the ridge. These men were literate. They understood the language of myth and spell, proportion and color. They knew which pigment to use for each god: yellow for women, red for men, green for rebirth, blue for divine hair, and lapis skies. They worked by lamplight. They mixed their paints from natural minerals: red ochre from hematite, yellow from iron-rich clays, green from malachite, and blue from ground azurite or synthetic Egyptian blue. One of the earliest man-made pigments in human history, and among them, there may have been one who walked into Tutankhamun's tomb knowing this would not be a usual job. Perhaps he was summoned late. Perhaps another artist had fallen ill. Or perhaps the political tension surrounding the burial had made the usual teams unavailable. Whoever he was, his hand appears once, a small set of brushstrokes, a few awkward angles in a god's fingers, a mismatched eye, and then nothing. His work vanishes midway across the wall. His style doesn't match the others. His technique is slightly off. The lines stutter. The color pool's too thick. And in that moment, the silence begins. Did he walk away? Was he dismissed? Or was he erased? Signature that wasn't a name. The western wall also contains something curious. A small, seemingly random swirl of red pigment, half hidden beneath the shoulder of a funerary deity. At first glance, it looks like a correction or a leftover sketching line, but the swirl matches the style of graffiti-like artists Mark found in other Theban tombs. Small flourishes left by artists, not as signatures in the modern sense, but as coded personal symbols. A flick of pride, a flourish of individuality in a system designed to suppress it. It's possible that this red swirl was never meant to be visible, that it was supposed to be plastered over, that in the rush it remained, and perhaps that was enough. In a world where kings could be forgotten and erased, and where entire religious systems were overthrown in a generation, leaving behind a swirl of red pigment might have felt like a kind of immortality. A name without letters, a memory without record. That swirl might be the only thing we ever know. About him, was he there when they buried the king? The burial of Tutankhamun was a complex affair. The chamber was far too small for all the items crammed into it. Beds, chariots, boxes, statues, a golden shrine, and the famous nested coffins. The final days must have been chaos, if the faceless baboon and the misaligned gods were signs of haste. They were also signs of presence. This unknown artist, let's call him the Vanisher, may have been there until the very last moment. He might have watched as the priests entered with oils and incense, as the embalmers carried the gilded coffin. Vizier, stepping into his role as high priest, performed the opening of the mouth ritual with the golden adze. The Vanisher might have ducked into the antechamber to avoid the scent of myrrh, or stood in the shadows as the burial shrines were lowered around the sarcophagus. And when it was done, when the last of the paint was dry and the rush of the ceremony passed, perhaps he was the last to leave, carrying his brush, stained in ochre, into the eternal light of Theban dawn. He would vanish from the record, but he would be known someday by a swirl of red and a missing face. Why do we still care about the wall he painted? In a world flooded with monuments to rulers and gods, it's easy to forget the people who built them, the ones whose backs bent under the limestone, the ones whose hands mixed the pigments, the ones who had no pyramids of their own, just a room in a village and a lifetime of assignments. And yet, these are the people whose stories whisper to us now, because Tutankhamun's tomb was never meant to last. It was a rush job, a substitute, but the ordinary hands that built it, even imperfectly, gave us one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time. And so we ask, was that smudged baboon just an accident? Was the swirl of red an unfinished draft? Was it a whisper from one forgotten man trying to say, I was here, I was here? You can almost imagine him there, the man we now call the Vanisher, his feet planted on the plaster floor, his right hand trembling slightly, holding a reed brush made soft at the tip through careful chewing and soaking. Behind him, shallow clay bowl filled with crushed ochre rests on a chipped stool. The lamp beside it hisses quietly, casting flickering light across the curved walls of the tomb. His eyes scan the surface, not just for design, but for damage. A crack here, a blemish there. The surface is uneven. The plaster rough in places. It's no time to fix it properly. So he adjusts his composition subtly, moving the edge of a god staff, shortening the line of a ceremonial kilt, just enough to fit the space. This isn't vanity, it's survival. His tomb must be finished before the next festival moon. The boy king is dead. The clock is ticking dot around him. Others murmur in the narrow corridor. Prentices mixing pigment in haste. A foreman pacing back and forth, wiping sweat from his neck with a rag turned nearly black from days of labor. A scribe counts jars of resin by torchlight, while someone whispers a spell meant to keep scorpions away from the linen-covered body. A tea in the tomb's central chamber. The Vanisher dips his brush again. He knows the rules. Every line must be bold, every proportion measured, every deity painted in accordance with canon. You do not improvise when painting for the gods. And yet, here he is, quietly changing things. Not to defy, but to manage. He moves a falcon's wing inward so it doesn't overlap the pillar crack. He shortens the glyph for everlasting so it fits beside the unfinished sun disk. This is what painting in a rush looks like. Not sloppiness, not rebellion, not compromise. The kind only an experienced hand would recognize. The paint itself told the story long before Howard Carter broke the seal in 1922. The Valley of the Kings had already yielded dozens of royal tombs, each elaborately painted with divine scenes. But what made Tutankhamun's tomb unique, aside from the undisturbed treasures, was the paint itself. When conservators first entered the burial chamber, they noticed something strange. Brown spots peppered the yellow-painted walls. At first, they feared mold. Then, as decades passed and the spots failed to spread, another theory emerged. The fungi had bloomed and died soon after the paint was applied. This suggested something critical. The walls had been sealed before the paint had fully dried. That might seem unremarkable, but in ancient Egyptian practice, particularly for a royal burial, paint drying was sacred time. The belief was that images came alive once the final brushstroke dried, not before. For Tutankhamun to be entombed before the scenes had cured was a major departure from ritual order, and that points us back to urgency, to pressure, to unfinished labor. To the Vanessa, he may have known, as he applied that ochre, that he wouldn't get a second pass, that once the burial was complete, no one, not even the highest priest, would be allowed to return to repaint or correct his work. The tomb would be sealed. The gods would accept what had been given, and so the paint stayed wet, and the brown spots stayed forever. A fungal fingerprint of a kingdom, rushing to bury its pharaoh. The signature hidden in standardization of Egyptian tomb art followed a strict visual language. Gods were painted in profile. Kings often had larger proportions than attendants. Colors were symbolically coded. Scenes were copied from templates stored and memorized by generations of artisans. This makes deviations all the more noticeable in the west wall of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. Some deities appear less fluid, their arms slightly too thick, their hands with uneven fingers. These aren't errors obvious to the average eye, but side by side with other tombs. Ramesses VI. For instance, the difference is striking. It was long assumed that multiple hands painted the chamber, perhaps 2 or 3, but further microscopic analysis of brushstrokes, layering, pigment thickness now suggests a far messier reality. Up to 5 painters, possibly working in shifts, possibly of varying skill levels, and at least one who is likely an apprentice or emergency replacement. That apprentice may have been our vanisher. Or perhaps he was the senior artisan brought in to triage the mistakes of younger hands. Either way, his presence is known not by what he painted, but by what had to be corrected. Layers upon layers of pigment, some still discernible, where lines were moved, gestures softened, faces realigned. His work was not visible as art, it was visible in its restraint, like a director who repositions an actor off stage. The corrections were his true brushstrokes, and they tell a story of someone trying to restore dignity to a burial teetering on the edge of chaos. Dear El Medina and the forgotten names, if you had followed the vanisher home, he might have walked back to a stone house in dear El Medina, the artist's village nestled between desert cliffs, not far from the royal necropolis. The men here weren't slaves, but skilled workers employed by the state, paid in grain and beer and oil. They left behind astraca, shards of limestone or pottery used for notes, complaints, sketches, even jokes. These fragments tell us about broken tools, sick relatives, the theft of a blanket, or quarrel over laundry water. On one piece, an artist sketched a bored baboon. On another, someone practiced writing a hymn and scratched it out with frustration. In this world, the vanisher might have had children. He might have taught a son how to grind azurite, or told stories about the gods as he prepared brushes in the evening light. He might have laughed over wine with fellow painters, or sat quietly at the edge of a communal courtyard, brushing sand from his sandals. And yet, no tablet bears his name. No ostracon links directly to the team who painted Tutankhamun's tomb, because his was not a world of glory. It was a world of labor, and the records were never meant for men like him. But the work, the hurried, imperfect, sacred work, remained. What did he know about the boy king? We often imagine that those who buried Tutankhamun revered him. The truth is more complicated. Tutankhamun ascended the throne at just 9 years old. He reversed the unpopular religious reforms of his father, Akhenaten, restoring the old gods. Young, possibly around 18 or 19, with no surviving heirs. His death may have been sudden, its reign short and politically fragile. 4. The artisans painting his tomb. He may have been more an assignment than a legend. They likely knew little about his character. They may have grumbled about the tomb's awkward angles, or the lack of proper spacing for the solar motifs. They may have cursed the rush, the late deliveries of plaster, strange behavior of Vizier I, who took the throne soon after. But still, they painted, because kings must be buried, because gods must be honored, and because the wall must be finished, even if the paint never dries. The question the wall still asks says you stare into the burial chamber today through the preserved glass that now protects the paintings from modern moisture. One truth hums quietly under all the golden myths and treasure-laden awe. This was a rush job, and yet it endures. It is this contradiction that makes the Vanisher's story so quietly powerful. He did not carve marble. He did not invent anything. He simply showed up, day after day, and painted a wall meant to hold the weight of a kingdom's spiritual hopes. In the process, he left behind a smudged baboon, a red swirl, hand pigment that never had the chance to dry. It is not the work of a master. It is the work of someone trying, which, perhaps, is what makes it last. In the hush of the burial chamber. Long after the foreign footsteps of 1920s explorers faded, and long after the hiss of restoration tools ceased, one detail still whispers beneath the polished interpretations of modern archaeology: the human element, not the golden mask, not the nested coffins, not the rumors of a curse, but the wall itself, and the man who painted it. This final section isn't about unraveling a mystery or revealing some long-forgotten secret. It's about noticing what remains, what time, theft, mold, and power could not erase. And it begins with silence. The room that held its breath you would expect a royal tomb to be expansive, echoing, full of symbolic corridors and heavenly ceiling frescoes. Tutankhamun's tomb was oddly small for a pharaoh. It lacked the full layout of a traditional New Kingdom burial. Instead, it offered something quieter, something that feels, even now, like an emergency. The layout consisted of just 4 rooms: an antechamber, a burial chamber, a treasury, and an annex. No grand pillared halls, no intricate staircases. Most strikingly, only the burial chamber walls were painted. Why? Because of time, and perhaps because of the nature of the boy who died. The vanisher, we can assume, knew this. He knew he had one chamber in which to encapsulate the passage of a soul into the afterlife. The pressure was immense, but the goal remained: to guide the pharaoh into eternity through images. So, he painted with ochre for the sun, with carbon black for the underworld, with Egyptian blue, laboriously created from crushed copper silicates for divine space. He painted scenes of the opening of the mouth ceremony, where Tutankhamun, portrayed with youthful calm, is presented to Osiris. An embrace is shown, intimate, stylized, serene, between the boy king and deities who will welcome him home. But the gestures feel stiff, the hands just slightly wrong, the eyes misaligned, the brushstrokes hurried, not botched, not disrespectful, just ... mortal. It's as if the tomb itself knew its occupant had not yet become a god of all the gold. What survived was painted. Tutankhamun's tomb was famously packed with treasure. Over 5,000 artifacts, chariots, thrones, jewelry, model boats, food containers, sandals. And yet, most of those items, despite their glittering importance, eventually left the tomb. They were documented, crated, removed, and placed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Some are now displayed in the Grand Egyptian Museum. Others are in climate-controlled storage, studied by scholars, or awaiting exhibitions. But the painted walls, they never moved. They remain in place. In that sunken burial chamber in the Valley of the Kings, the only decorated room in the tomb. Why? Because the paintings could not be safely removed. The pigment was delicate, the plaster fragile, the scenes fused into the very stone. If moved, they would crumble. And so they stayed. They outlasted the looters of antiquity, the explorers of empire, the curators and directors and politicians, the changing regimes, the museum funding cycles. They could not be monetized. They could not be toured around the world. They could not be auctioned. So they were preserved. Ironically, because they were stuck. And in being stuck, they became the most authentic part of the tomb. Layers beneath the surface. Modern imaging, multispectral scans, infrared reflectography has revealed subtle changes beneath the paint. And it's made mid-process. Hidden outlines beneath final forms. A jackal once shifted a few inches. A scepter was shortened. The angle of a leg was corrected. Each adjustment was deliberate, calculated, quiet. These changes were not random. They point to a hand that saw the flaws and cared enough to fix them, to a man who may not have known that the burial chamber it painted would one day be the most famous in the world, who may not have known that foreign voices would one day peer through plexiglass and whisper his brushstrokes into audio guides. He only knew the deadline, dot, and the prayer, because the ancient Egyptian worldview depended on more than stone. It needed images. Pictures made the spiritual landscape real. If a god was not drawn, he could not guide. If the pharaoh was not depicted, he could not walk into eternity. So this man, this vanisher, held eternity in his hand and drew it on a wall. The paint held feelings. Two-color in ancient Egypt was not decorative, it was symbolic. Each hue was a spell. Yellow, like the gold it evoked, signified the eternal, the indestructible nature of the sun and the gods. Red could suggest vitality, but also danger. Black was fertility, the Nile's life-giving silt. White meant purity,